Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me and other distinguished guests such as Benjamino and Paige Moffett for today, which is the third in our series of historical lectures sponsored by the CIO in celebration of NRO's 50th anniversary. We hope you also mark your calendars and can attend some of the future lectures we have coming later this year on, have your pencils out, 31 March, 25 April, and 27 May. You all just remember that. This is the NRO after all. Also, I'm told I'm asked to remind you to please remove your badge, as I did, because this will be filmed. Corona. The name conjures the image of one of the pillars upon which our business is built. When the first film capsule was caught on August 19, 1960, it began a revolution not only in collection, but in the use of sophisticated command and control systems in reconnaissance. Our guest today, Colonel Select David Arnold, will lift the veil on the forerunner of the systems we use today. Colonel Select Arnold is currently Deputy Chief, Strategy and Policy Division, DoD Executive Agents for Space Staff. Previously, he served as Deputy Commander, 821st Air Base Group, and Deputy Installation Commander at Thule Air Base in Greenland. Prior to that assignment, he commanded the 22nd Space Operations Squadron, where he was responsible for the operational direction of 8 worldwide remote tracking stations constituting the Air Force Satellite Control Network. The author of numerous articles and papers, including Spying of Space, Constructing America's Satellite Command and Control Networks. He is the recipient of the Gil Rob Wilson Award from the NRO for his writing on national defense. Outside government, he voluntarily edits a quarterly called Quest, The History of Spaceflight Quarterly. He is a certified command space professional with 173 ICBM combat crew alerts, over 300 Defense Support Program missions, and 2 overseas remote assignments. It is my pleasure to introduce Colonel David Arnold.
Sounds impressive. I'd like to meet that guy she just spoke about. He sounds impressive. Thank you all for having me this afternoon. It is really wonderful. As we like to say over at the Puzzle Palace, any day out of the Pentagon is a good day. So it's really nice to be out here in the sun and up here with the people who live above the earth, unlike those of us in the Pentagon. I got to tell you, though, that my first presentation that I ever gave as a historian was on a Sunday morning at a military history conference in Omaha, Nebraska. And it was to 6 people, 3 of whom were on the panel. So it really is satisfying for me to see so many folks turn out to hear what I'm going to talk about today, which is how to fly Corona. I'm, of course, not going to tell you how to fly Corona because we don't do that anymore, but I'm going to tell you about how they started flying Corona. You've all heard of Corona for sure. You've seen the bucket over in the visitor center, which I really enjoy seeing every time. But what I'm going to talk about today is how the guys who invented flying satellites did it by flying Corona. So let's see if I can get this to work. Ta-da, okay. On Discoverer 14's 17th orbit, a controller at the Kodiak Remote Tracking Station transmitted the eject command to the spacecraft. 300 miles above the Earth, explosive bolts fired and separated the film-carrying re-entry vehicle from the Agena vehicle, beginning the gold-plated bucket's fiery journey back to Earth. At 50,000 feet, the capsule's parachute opened and it began transmitting its automatic radio beacon. As the capsule's descent slowed to 1,600 feet per second, Air Force Captain Harold Mitchell and the crew of Pelican 9, a recovery-equipped C-119 flying boxcar like that one, caught up to the descending capsule in plenty of time. Mitchell passed over the parachute twice, each one closer to the water than before, and he was unable to snag the re-entry vehicle. But on the third pass, a slight tug on the controls of the C-119 told him he would go down in history as the first pilot to catch a falling star. Discoverer 14 included the first air-recovered film capsule and returned more imagery of the Soviet Union than the 24 previous U-2 flights combined. The Discoverer biomedical satellite program was the public cover story for the nation's highly covert Corona reconnaissance satellite program. And though the cover story faded away in the 1960s, the Corona program continued until the early 1970s. Operating satellites in the 1960s was the combination of innovation and inspiration with more than a dash of perspiration thrown in. That sounded better when I wrote it. Flying satellites then was very much like it is today. The biggest difference was they invented what we do today. This afternoon, I want to give you a glimpse into flying satellites in the very first days of space-based reconnaissance. Incidentally, this is the journal that I edit. That is the cover of an issue that we did last summer, which was basically dedicated to the 50 years of space-based reconnaissance. There's a really couple of nice pieces in there, in fact, one by our own on the Corona program, and a few others in there that are really nice. It's an issue devoted to the reconnaissance program. We don't normally do issues devoted to a single subject, but this particular one was a lot of fun. The interview is the interview that I did with Lieutenant General Forrest McCartney, former SMC commander, one of the first guys, I'll talk about him in a few minutes, to fly satellites. And it was the interview that I did with him when I did my dissertation research back in the early 2000s. There we go. In the April 1960 edition of Air Force and Space Digest, General Charles Terhune, the new vice commander of the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division, talked about the last great frontier. He described the Sunnyvale-based 6594th Test Wing as the nation's first organization set up to exclusively launch, track, acquire, and recover a satellite program. A news release issued in October 1960 said nothing about Strategic Air Command or Air Defense Command. The news release described Project Samos as an R&D program to determine the capabilities for making observations of the Earth from satellites. And it made it clear that Vandenberg, Hawaii, and the Kodiak Tracking Station had primary responsibility for on-orbit telemetry tracking and commanding, while the Satellite Test Center at Sunnyvale received all the orbital data and exercised command and control over Samos. Also in the article, General Terhune described the Blue Suit operations in Sunnyvale. The goal of operations included direction to achieve at the earliest practical time the capability to operate and maintain with military personnel the command, control, engineering, data processing, and computing associated with the Satellite Test Annex in Sunnyvale and the tracking stations in Alaska, California, Hawaii, and the new one in New Hampshire. Tracking, control, and communication with orbiting vehicles would be performed by staffs of NCOs and Os, whom the Air Force considered similar to the troops servicing fighters, bombers, and cargo planes. Civilian technicians would do R&D, but with operational systems, these jobs will belong, said General Terhune, to the men and women who wear Air Force blue. However, the Air Force had no uniformed expertise in operating and maintaining satellites. So the first Air Force officers joined contractors already on console in 1959. Forrest McCartney, now a retired Air Force Lieutenant General, joined the program in 1960 with two other Air Force captains, Mel Lewin and Al Cruz, shortly after Discoverer II's loss in Norway. The Air Force assigned the three space operations pioneers to work alongside Lockheed employees. To conceal the true nature of their mission from the public, these young captains wore civilian business attire as somebody's idea of security. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. Recalled General McCartney, I kind of pushed back on it in the beginning, but it was such an exciting time we really didn't have a big deal with civilian clothes. And recalled Colonel Lewin, McCartney's carpool partner at the time and now a retired Air Force colonel, I was so excited about what I was doing and enjoyed it a lot. It's not often you get in at the start of something. The face of the new planned aerospace force could be found in the Air Force Ballistic Missile Division. Curious young scientists and engineers, both civilians and military, built the new organization and installed an ambitious focus. The leadership, a mix of seasoned officers, NCOs, and contractors, knew that experience gained through failure could be just as important as success. Young technicians with stripes on their arms and sometimes only knee-high socks stood behind them with knowledge and new tools, tuning and adjusting systems. The system tolerated failure in those days. It doesn't tolerate failure today. True to the engineering culture of the day, James Plummer, Lockheed's Corona program manager and later DNRO, looked on every launch as a successful engineering test, whether or not it provided reconnaissance of the Soviet Union. Said Mr. Plummer, we didn't look at those as 12 failures, we looked at them as 12 successes. We were learning new things every time, in every part of the missile and the recovery and all of the things that we had to do. If it hadn't been for President Eisenhower's support for the CIA's approach to the program, of course Corona would have been canceled. National leaders, the press, the public, and so on placed a different premium on success because no one had ever launched satellites into space and used them to gather intelligence. Today we talk about learning from failure. These inventors formalized that process in the early days, even if they didn't call it lessons learned. Said one former operator, we just called it experience. But that's one thing we were doing, trying to go to school each day on each thing we did, on those things that would work, on those things that worked well, and on those things that didn't work well. Said another veteran, a little more simply, let's have a Coke, say hello to the wife and kids, and go back to it. These Corona operators paved the way for all satellite operators using only their engineering education to get them going because no formal training program existed for any of the new satellite flyers, contractors, or uniformed. 3 weeks after they arrived in Sunnyvale, that original group of 3 captains had become the experts. Before actual flight testing began, the captains worked only in the back room on the displays, supporting the Lockheed engineers on the consoles. The officers drew with grease pencils on acetate, putting view graphs up on screens or closed-circuit TV for the satellite controllers to see. Nobody knew anything more than the Lockheed guys did. The airmen's operational experience grew right along with the Lockheed employees. The captains didn't have the technical expertise on the vehicle itself, but in terms of operational satellite control, they essentially possessed as much expertise as the Lockheed people. Now, to be fair, you could describe the early Corona reconnaissance satellite system as the Model T of the satellite business. McCartney and company didn't have all that far to go on the learning curve of this rudimentary system when they arrived in 1959. The first generation Corona vehicles had only 4 commands. Those of you who've flown satellites, can you imagine flying a satellite with 4 commands? Reset, increase or decrease, and a gray command. Responding to a telephone call, a controller sent an order to the tracking station that sent a command to the satellite. The gray command controlled the camera, although the operators not cleared for the Corona program didn't know it. And not knowing did not keep the officers from discussing the possible uses for the gray command until the CIA eventually cleared them. According to McCartney, the trio speculated aloud a little too often, and so the CIA briefed them to keep them quiet. Colonel Lewin recalled going over to the Lockheed Advanced Projects facility in Menlo Park, where they saw a Corona vehicle under construction. He said, "We were very impressed with how important we were at the time." McCartney later flew Discoverer 14 the night the Corona camera took the first picture recovered from space. Today, a copy of this airfield hangs on the wall in his home office. Today, we use fiber optics and wideband data streams and distribute data from satellites, but in the early days of space operations, sending telemetry was over telephone lines. Telemetry in the 1950s and 60s, as it does now, contained important facts about systems, status, or for calculating a satellite's orbit, not mission data, and it was essential for troubleshooting. The data came down from satellites at relatively high speeds, frequency modulated onto sine wave subcarriers, and we're getting to the edge of my technical expertise here, and the tracking station recorded it all on magnetic tape. After the satellite passed from view, recorder operators rewound the tape and brought its speed down until it moved slow enough to transmit on a low data rate telephone line. An operator first made a voice phone call to the data center in Sunnyvale, and when the recorder operator signaled ready to record, the tracking station patched the tape playback in place of the telephone handset and then rolled the tape. Lockheed satellite engineers often needed a vital piece of data on the tape, and transmitting it using this method got them the data faster than mailing the tape or flying it directly from Alaska. Tracking station controllers called the system slowpoke because the unattended tape usually played back at 1/32 of the original record speed, requiring 32 minutes to deliver 1 minute's worth of telemetry. Most satellite supports at the Alaskan tracking station on Kodiak Island or at Annette Island lasted 5 minutes or longer, requiring more than 2.5 hours to retransmit a single satellite support operation. Fortunately, the trackers seldom resent a full mission's worth of data to avoid tying up the only phone line these isolated locations had. Usually, they only sent information to the command center and did not receive actual satellite support information because of comm outages or information that particularly interested engineers. Controllers at the tracking station had contact with the outside world only through one phone line and one 100-word per minute teletype machine. If during a transmission the telephone operator in Sunnyvale needed to connect a northbound call and tap the line to Cody or Ann to see if somebody was using it, She, and it was a she, might have only heard funny beeps and boops on the line. If she thought there was a line failure, she might disconnect the call and log the line out to maintenance. Being in the send-only mode, Cody couldn't know of the disconnect until the tape ran out hours later, wasting hours of time. The tracking station controllers eventually let the phone operators know what they were doing wrong, and the phone operators learned about data transmission. Said one former operator at Cody, "Slow poke worked fine, but it sure was slow." You guys are laughing at the right time. That's good. The first Corona vehicles required satellite controllers to have considerable situational awareness for a successful mission. A continuous punched mylar tape controlled systems on the vehicle, so the satellite controller had to know what the tape had reached and what point the vehicle had reached in its orbit, all from hundreds of miles away. Controllers reset the tape and increased or decreased the speed of the tape to match whatever orbit the Thor-Agena combination happened to inject into, which was an imprecise feat at the time. Some would say it's kind of imprecise today. In the early satellites, contractors put the tape together just before launch because they knew what the targets would be. The mylar tape had 13 channels for the 13 fingers that rode on the top of the tape. When the contact went into one of the rectangular holes, it activated a relay and initiated a function, a simple binary system on or off. Using the tape, operators turned receivers on or off, camera on or off, reset the monitor, whatever they needed to do. Adding to the challenge and emphasizing the importance of situational awareness, the operators also had to take into account errors on the tape. Although the CIA mostly pre-planned each mission, the success of the operation relied on the operators on console to synchronize the timer to get the satellite to operate the way the reconnaissance community needed it to perform. Also in California, Charles Murphy was the lone CIA officer in Palo Alto in charge of setting up the reconnaissance program. On active duty with the Air Force, but assigned to the CIA, he had been a B-36 Peacemaker navigator and a key role player in the development of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. Murphy figured out how to use the advanced reconnaissance system by determining the best time of day to launch to ensure adequate daylight in the Soviet Union's target area and what altitude to launch into to get the best pictures. Coordinating with analysts at the National Photo Interpretation Center, as it was known then, he learned about what scale meant to photo interpreters, how they liked to have targets illuminated, how much sun they needed, and the effect of shadows. People had thought about and had been meeting needs like these for a long time for aerial reconnaissance, but mission planning for satellites differed because the camera system, instead of flying a few thousand feet in the air, now flew 100 miles above the Earth. Murphy eventually figured out the way that the intelligence community could use Corona as a search system, not a spotting system. Eventually, the photo interpreters discovered many of the targets of American nuclear weapons didn't lie where the planners thought they did. In fact, in Murphy's opinion, the maps were so bad that a nuclear strike by the United States on the USSR may not have been successful. By himself, then, Murphy figured out launch windows and began turning the satellite program into a useful tool for gathering intelligence of the USSR. The CIA planned satellite reconnaissance missions weeks ahead of time, but found it an inefficient way to operate. Bad weather over the target area of the USSR or a vehicle anomaly could mean the camera took pictures of clouds or worse, nothing. They wouldn't find out about that, though, until they had caught the bucket, processed the film. Murphy tried to convince the Lockheed engineers to build a command into the satellite to give control of the camera to the operators at the satellite control facility in Sunnyvale. We finally got one command for the camera system, which was kind of a simple-minded thing, too. You could tell it to ignore the next hole in the tape or use the next hole in the tape. That's the way we turned the camera on and off. To help preserve the most precious commodity on board, the satellite, its 20 pounds of Kodak film, Lockheed gave the satellite operators some control over the payload by adding a few commands. But a simple system didn't mean an easy one to operate. To keep a single controller from getting into too much trouble, they always worked in pairs, with one who sat as the primary controller and one who watched as the backup. At first, Air Force officers always backed up the Lockheed controllers. Operations were segregated until the young officers displayed their capability to control satellites without contractor crew partners. Lockheed had some concern, and probably the program office in LA did too, because everyone easily tripped up during rehearsals and made mistakes. But that's what rehearsals were for, right? If someone made a mistake and a controller lost a real vehicle, the implications could have been enormous. Leadership quickly figured out that the airmen learned quickly and worked as proficiently as the contractors, So slowly, the military shifted over into the primary role for satellite support ops, rotating the senior position among the three of them. Eventually, they got to the point where they can operate as an all-military crew, with one primary and another backup, and then switch seats. Not surprisingly, the young officers and their contractor comrades did not fit together like fingers in a glove. McCartney, for example, had a problem working for Lockheed. The contractors, not particularly hard to work with, looked upon the three officers, thought McCartney, not as the customer, but so much as the competition. McCartney and company thought of themselves as more capable than the Lockheed folks and did not make much secret of that, which probably ruffled some feathers. McCartney said, "It was probably pretty cocky too, but we were good. I call it friendly competition, but we were dead serious about making sure that we could be better than the Lockheed controllers were. And what's better is meaning that you can handle support smoother. You had a better command, knew what the equipment was doing and not doing. You knew the capabilities of the crews at the stations. We used to practice endless hours with the crews at the stations, and we could work problems faster." As far as McCartney was concerned, relative skills as a satellite operator had nothing to do with education. Everyone involved in the satellite reconnaissance business had a comparable engineering education. In McCartney's mind, the military officers' ability to think faster and maintain their composure under pressure made them better operators. Then Captain Mel Lewin had an uncanny ability to put an enormous amount of data on a single slide. He got the forms and the data and the tools that new satellite operators needed, crutches he called them, and they always carried a set of their own cheat sheets that helped prompt them. In addition, the Corona program performed an on-orbit operation almost every day, whether a vehicle orbited or not, by taking tapes from previous flights and playing back the data. The technician in the back of the control room tried to see if he could devise a problem that would fool the person trying to control the vehicle. General McCartney recalled that sitting on console as a satellite operator felt like a pressure cooker thing, he said, because in those early days that equipment was not very good to you. You really had to think ahead, and you had to be able to assess the situation, understand what was going on, think on your feet, figure out what to do, and do it. And you didn't have time for other people to do any real prompting of you. They never treated a rehearsal or a simulation like a game. The operators learned through the devious problems they threw at each other. Eventually, all the rehearsal time paid off big time. Before achieving a fully blue suit status, one capable of standardized operations, the system had to be more formalized. Eventually, the three young captains became full-fledged test controllers, and Lockheed scheduled them along with their own people. This small achievement marked the beginning of the Air Force's short-lived transition to all-military space operations. McCartney and crew sat on console, pulled shifts, equals with the Lockheed employees. Lewin confirmed McCartney's estimation of the Air Force relationship with the contractor. We were equals with the Lockheed guys, and we worked side by side with them. No differences separated a Lockheed employee and a uniformed satellite controller. They worked side by side without distinction. They all had a great deal of pride in what they did, and the Lockheed people made them part of the team very quickly. Thinking back on his days in the Corona program, McCartney said, "No one had a feeling one way or another about moving satellite operations to uniformed personnel. We just always thought it would happen and took it for granted. We just believed that it would happen. I mean, it was just a question of time. I never questioned but that sooner or later it would transition to blue suiters." Colonel Fritz Oder, head of the satellite program office in LA, had a transition to military operations in mind all along. See, the Air Force didn't have a satellite operations career field for officers or enlisted people until the 1980s. The Air Force Satellite Control Facility had to derive capable operators from a number of different Air Force career fields, many already critically staffed, difficult to fill, and difficult to retain. The problem grew only more critical as the U.S. expanded its role in Vietnam and as the aerospace industry expanded to meet the needs of the space program, the Apollo program in particular, and the needs of the Cold War. The unique environment meant a large OJT investment with a small return on outlay because of low retention and low experience, and it all added up to chronic personnel problems. The lack of training material challenged newly assigned airmen the most. Second Lieutenant Lou Adams joined the Air Force Satellite Control Facility in 1966 after graduation from Radar Maintenance Officer School at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. Because the Air Force didn't have a space operations career field for officers or enlisted, it sent them to the schools that most closely resembled the work they would do in the Air Force Satellite Control Facility. Assigned to New Boston Tracking Station in New Hampshire as an operations controller, Adams almost immediately noticed the wide variety of people working there. In the control room, contractors and officers of varied backgrounds, education, and experience all did the same basic everyday jobs. In the work centers, contractors and enlisted personnel worked side by side. Adams had no formal training program or written material to study, so he faced no small challenge learning to become an operations controller. Each individual satellite program published and distributed a technical operations order, which should sound familiar to some of you, which described the requirements, operations concepts, and technical aspects of the satellite in a particular family, but nothing existed to put it all together for a trainee. Training essentially followed the hit-and-miss process of over-the-shoulder observation, asking questions, and reading any available pertinent material. Into the mid-1960s, the Air Force still largely did OJT, despite whatever technical training the service provided beforehand. The technological constraints of the system of the day impacted the ability of operators to carry out tasks in real time. One of the most important constraints was the significance of an operator's decision, just as it is today. The time required to receive and analyze data, make decisions, and generate commands could be less than 5 minutes for a satellite with a 300 nautical mile orbit. Once an operator made a decision, it became nearly impossible to take corrective action, given the short satellite support operation times at the stations because of their low orbits. Controllers planned the flight and flew the plan. For near-Earth orbits, some controllers used the 6-second rule. 2 seconds to identify the problem, 2 seconds to decide what to do, and then 2 seconds to do it. When in doubt, they saved the vehicle to prevent a catastrophic failure. But because the program faced the possibility of losing a Corona satellite and its critical national security information, the program needed people who knew how to operate the system. Actually, in April 1959, the Corona program did lose a reconnaissance satellite. Discoverer 2 successfully reached orbit in the correct orientation, tail first, and stabilized in all 3 axes, the first satellite ever 3-axis stabilized. The test plan called for an automatic reentry, but the satellite orbited too low. As Discoverer 2 passed over Kodiak, a controller entered the sequence to reset the timer on the automatic reentry counter. The console erroneously showed that he had sent the wrong command, so he re-entered the command sequence. Then, under time pressure, he forgot to press the reset button, and the new commands entered the vehicle, which added them to the old ones and locked out any further attempt to get into the vehicle. On April 14th, one day after the launch, the capsule ejected from the vehicle and came down not in the warm Hawaiian ballpark where C-119 pilots waited to snatch it from the sky, but on snowy Spitsbergen Island north of Norway, where Sergei Khrushchev, son of the Soviet premier, later confirmed that the Soviets had recovered it for Korolov's design bureau. And then somebody went out and made a movie about it called Ice Station Zebra. In late January 1968, for example, on mission 1045, Corona Flight 123, the vehicle ran into some difficulties when the Field Test Force Director, also called an FTFD or a FUTFUD, made an error calculating the number of commands required to go from acquisition to fade, in part because of abnormal telemetry from the vehicle. The problem occurred because the other operators didn't verify his calculations. The operations planner and the test controller simply initialed the master command sheet, assuming the FUTFUD had got it right. The incident prompted an investigation, and Colonel Charles Murphy, the investigating officer, relieved the FUTFUD of his position and issued letters of reprimand to the individuals on duty that day who failed to verify the command calculations. Colonel Murphy also introduced a new procedure to prevent recurrence, making each member of the control team compute the number independently. And they, of course, weren't doing this with calculators or computers. They were doing it with slide rules and by hand. The Air Force considered a lack of formal training acceptable because of the test nature of the space environment. Trying to learn and understand orbital mechanics challenged the newest space operators who learned without formal schools or textbooks for satellite hardware, orbital mechanics, or vehicle commanding. The satellite operators depended on Lockheed to help them with tech training, such as understanding Agena commands and what the commands did. Lockheed built the Agena right across the street from the satellite operations area in Building 104, so the operators often went over there to see the equipment before it reached orbit. Life for a new satellite operator included constant study and an internal class. The operators went to meetings, got data, and would say, hey, that's a good book on that. So they, in a sense, scavenged their equipment and their libraries, figuring out what forms made the best sense. Corona's status as a test program, albeit one that provided critical national security information to the national command authorities, let them take their time. Managers and technicians preferred a concept of operations that resisted standardization in favor of the flexibility of the test environment. To normalize space operations, the Air Force tried to operationalize space to make satellite command and control more like flying standardized fighter or tanker aircraft than specialized test planes. The Air Force struggled while trying to standardize satellite command and control operations because no one really had any idea how to control a satellite in the first place. That guy standing in the back is Carl Murphy. The introduction of the Mission Control Center in the mid-1960s standardized satellite operations procedures more than any checklist-driven culture could have. General Jewel C. Maxwell chaired the Space Support Panel in Project Forecast. Annex E, Space Command and Control, laid out a roadmap for developing future space test facilities and operational command and control networks. The logical path, the Maxwell panel argued, meant developing space operations the same way that airmen had developed air operations for a generation, using the concept of centralized control and decentralized execution. To work as efficiently as it worked for airplanes, the concept first required decentralized mission control centers. In the new concept of space operations, mission control center commanders had complete operational control of their satellites, just as pilots had complete operational control over their aircraft. Each mission control center had the ability to receive, analyze, and process payload data, generate their own orbital ephemeris, and issue commands. The Maxwell panel conceived of mission control centers as decentralized elements in the space mission, mission-oriented control centers, they called it, capable of performing all of the unique or peculiar functions necessary for a satellite's mission, often reconnaissance of the Soviet bloc. As independent units plugging into the common user Air Force Satellite Control Facility, mission control centers could be added to or deleted from the satellite command and control system without major disruption. The mission control center concept also increased the independence of the individual satellite programs. During a mission, satellite operators in a mission control center exercise control over the ground facilities of the Air Force Satellite Control Facility only for the period allotted by the schedule. After the mission time elapsed, another mission control center that had prearranged for the time could step in and take over control of the resources of the AFSCN, what was then called the AFSCF. Using the analogy of the air traffic control system, the report stressed that supporting satellites could be just as simple as flying airplanes and scheduling commercial airliners. The mission control center concept also provided added security and isolation for the various satellite programs. With satellite operations and planning contained in a single unit behind a single entry door, satellite programs increased the level of secrecy of their missions. In May 1966, crews in the first Mission Control Center conducted a satellite support with the Hawaii tracking station using the new concept. The Mission Control Center concept thereafter became the standard for satellite command and control. Today, every Air Force Satellite Operations Squadron operates under this concept. In late 1966, several satellite programs moved their operations into Mission Control Center complexes. Satellite programs using the Mission Control Center concept found the complex to be, quote, very satisfactory. By the end of 1966, while operations continued in the central control room, the 4 Mission Control Centers gave Sunnyvale the capability to support 10 different satellite programs at once. Satellite operations increased dramatically in the period that followed, and in the first 6 months of 1966, the Air Force Satellite Control Facility's worldwide network of antennas supported 64 vehicles, doing 3,776 supports, which was an increase of 56% over the year before. By the late 1960s, the test controller, now called a mission commander, worked with key personnel in a single, secure, multi-room complex, keeping track of data as a computer displayed it on a TV screen in a centralized operations room. The functions performed in the complex included orbit planning, data analysis, payload analysis, command generation, and direction of the tracking station assigned for support of the satellite. The new mission control console had 7 television monitors on which the operators could select any one of 20 separate telemetry channels, all coming into the complex in real time thanks to the Space Ground Link subsystem modification, SIGLS. The console also had 2 remote control units for 35mm projectors, secure and non-secure telephone lines, and time display units. In Aerospace Corporation's opinion, the Mission Control Center arrangement more effectively employed the highly trained engineer and technician personnel assigned to Sunnyvale. Yet by the end of the 1960s, facing shortages of personnel and a negative review from the Government Accounting Office, the Air Force gave up on uniformed operations and maintenance and fell back on the original personnel plan, using contractors to perform the vital national service of satellite command and control. The engineers inside and outside the Air Force, whether contractors, civilians, or military, built Corona because they had the unbounded faith, in each other that they could get the job done, and they had the technology to make satellite command and control work. And in the middle of the Cold War, they also had unbounded faith in their country, knowing that the network that they built supported the National Space Program, an international source of prestige for the United States. Those with special access worked with extra diligence, knowing that the Corona program supported the National Reconnaissance Program, considered essential to the country's security in the dangerous days of the Cold War and after. Thanks very much. I'll take a few questions if you've got them. Nobody wants to be first? Yes, sir.
How long would a vehicle actually last in orbit?
How long would a vehicle actually be on orbit? The first Corona vehicles were on orbit for 17 revs, and then they came back. So not very long, given an hour and a half around the Earth, depending on what orbit they went into. Good question, though. Thanks. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
The bucket they lost in Norway, the only bucket they lost?
No, actually, the first, it depends on how you count, but the first 14 missions were unsuccessful. There was the first mission, actually, they decided to go for broke, and they put a camera on Corona 1. And it didn't even make it into orbit. It crashed in Chile. That launched from Vandenberg to Chile. That's a straight shot, really, but it didn't even... but they did send a couple of guys in probably a B-29, I would think. They sent down to South America to try and recover it, and they did actually recover pieces of it. That was the first mission, unless you count the mission before that, which guys at the time referred to as Discoverer Zero, because the separation rockets actually fired while the booster was still on the pad. So the booster itself was unusable. They refurbed the Agena and the Corona information, or the Corona payload, and then put it on a later booster, and it eventually left Vandenberg as well. Discoverer 2 you mentioned, but something went wrong with the first 13. Discoverer 13 was a fully successful mission right up until the catch. And they didn't catch it. They never saw it, the C-119s, and it actually landed in the Pacific Ocean. But they knew where it came down because they watched it come down, even though they didn't catch it. And they dropped a couple of Air Force frogmen, what we used to call them in those days, off the side of a boat, and they got in a rubber dinghy and spent the night with it. And while the Navy could steam something out there to get a ship close to it. They took it, they put it on the Navy ship, and they put it way up high in a kind of a way for a C-119 to come by and catch it as if it were trying to catch it. So they catch this bucket off of a Navy ship now instead of falling out of the sky at thousands of feet in altitude, and they flew it back to Hawaii. And then they took that particular bucket, which had a flag in it and some diagnostic equipment, and brought it back to DC. So that's really the first object recovered from space on purpose. But Discoverer 14 actually had a camera on it, was actually caught by the C-119s, the information was processed, and that really is the beginning of the Corona revolution, the intelligence space revolution. But Mr. Plummer said, we looked at them as 14 successes, not 14 failures, because they learned something new every time about what they needed to get done. And they had the leeway to learn from their mistakes and move on after that. I'm not so sure that we could go 14 launches on a new program. That's a lot of nervous laughter. Yes, sir.
How did they guarantee re-entry of the film? Was it literally shot down?
The film was protected in its...
How was the module of the film was connected? How was that? What did they do to make sure that was pointed? Do they know exactly what the altitude?
They knew the orientation. If you can imagine, the Agena is basically a long tube, and the Corona piece is at the end where the camera is, and then there's the film return bucket at the very far end. They needed to make sure that the Agena, which had been oriented like this so that the camera, which was on the side, could be taking pictures, was then reoriented so that it could eject the bucket back. There were a couple of them that, again, they missed, and the orientation, instead of going like this, went like that. Okay, so there's a couple of buckets. In fact, there was a bucket that came back a couple of years ago. It had been up there for a long time. So these things do come back eventually, but, I don't think we'd learn anything new from that film, even if we could have recovered it. So. But it was all, you got to understand what the vehicle is doing and what orientation it's all in, and you got to do it from hundreds of miles away, and you have no idea, really, except what you know.
What would you say were the big lessons learned from operations in the Corona program that carried over to later programs after Corona?
That's a good question, and in this environment, I don't want to talk about later programs. So I probably will stick with a generic answer, something along the lines of the Mission Control Center concept, which we're all familiar with from NASA, movies about NASA and all that kind of stuff. But that concept really, that started here. And folks flying satellites today in Mission Control Centers, that started in the mid-1960s. That's probably the thing that endures the most. Now, not every ground station uses an isolated satellite program. Some of them are different. But that is essentially the concept that the Air Force uses today. The GPS squadron, for example, at Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, or outside of Colorado Springs, that is a mission control center. It has one program of one family of satellites that it flies, only GPS. It doesn't do anything else but GPS. And just down the hall from them is the Milstar satellite flying squadron that flies Milstar and AEHF. Two comm satellites that do basically the same thing. So that's kind of the thing that continues on from the early days of the Corona program. And then there's the whole, they just kind of learned. And we are the beneficiaries of that. Those of us who have flown satellites, as I'm sure many of you have, we stand on the shoulders of those guys who learned it by just doing it and figuring it out. All that learning situational awareness and how to process telemetry and how to do rehearsals, all that stuff was stuff that they learned that we still do today. So, thanks. Yes, sir.
You talked about the relationship between the contractors and the Air Force and Lockheed. What about the Air Force and CIA's relationship during Corona?
There are two different relationships in the Corona program between the Air Force and the CIA in the 60s. There's the DC relationship and there's the Sunnyvale relationship. The DC relationship was very rocky. The Air Force and the CIA never got along. Even after the NRO was created in 61, the Air Force and the CIA just did not get along. The CIA felt the Air Force was pushing to get along because they launched every month, and the CIA guys, they felt that the Air Force, all they cared about was getting the launches done. They didn't care about when the buckets were at, when the film was actually needed, that sort of thing. And the Air Force thought that CIA was being slow and they were being too deliberative and that kind of thing. But that was all happening in Washington. In Sunnyvale, they got along really well. Colonel Murphy will tell you that he did everything that he needed to do, and he worked with the field task force directors on a daily basis, and he represented the CIA, but he was out there by himself trying to help these guys figure out how to take pictures of the Soviet Union and get the film back. And they understood that sometimes the bureaucratic stuff that goes on inside the Beltway and maybe slightly outside the Beltway, that's all just DC stuff. We got a mission, we got to fly this satellite, we got to take pictures of the bad guys, and we got to figure out where the nukes are. That's what they were doing in Sunnyvale, and they got along really, really well. So there's those two kinds of things, and you'll kind of see that probably out in the field today. I'm just thinking, maybe. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned the bucket that went down to Svalbard, I think, did the Soviets, were they able to reverse engineer any of that? Did they get anything out of that?
I have not found any evidence that they were able to get anything out of the bucket that came back down in Norway. It's entirely possible that they figured out something related to ablative techniques. One of the reasons that why we started shooting buckets of film back instead of transmitting the data back the way we do today is that ablative techniques had changed. Instead of being these heavy things that required huge, massive boosters to get into orbit just to return them so that they didn't burn up on reentry, they started using gold-plated buckets, and they had different kinds of techniques that were actually developed in the ICBM program for nuclear warheads that they could use in the Corona program in order to get the film back. It is possible, though I doubt very likely, that the Soviets learned something from the bucket because the Soviets were developing their own ICBMs. Now, of course, one of the reasons why the Soviets developed the R-7 booster was because their bomb was so huge. And one of the reasons why their bomb was so huge was because the physics was different than we were using for thermonuclear weapons. But that's sort of a different question for a different day. So, but thanks. Yes, sir.
Was there ever a concept, because I had read this at one point, of doing onboard film processing and retransmission of the images, but it was very costly or unproven? Can you talk about that concept at that time?
There were quite a few proposals at the time. One of the reasons that we went with Corona when we did was because we needed something quickly. And why did we need something quickly? Because Francis Gary Powers had just been shot down over the Soviet Union trying to take pictures. So President Eisenhower needed reconnaissance of the Soviet Union, and he didn't have airplanes to do it anymore. So Corona becomes a crash program. Corona went from design, execution, here's what we're going to do, to its first launch in 9 months. Now, it wasn't successful for another year, but first launch in 9 months. But there had been a lot of other proposals on the table up to that. I mean, the Air Force had been studying the problem of how do you do reconnaissance from space for years. Actually, the first study that the Air Force did was done by what became the RAND Corporation in the 40s. And it was actually General LeMay who commissioned the study. So the Air Force had been looking at it for a long time, and one of the proposals was to take the pictures and transmit them back, process the film on board, exactly as you said, process the film on board the satellite, transmit it back using a TV signal, then clean up the signal, and then actually print the pictures out at the site where they came down, and then go to the other side of the building or whatever and have the photo interpreters look at them right there. That was a proposal. We never bought that one. But one of the reasons we went with Corona the way we did was because we needed something really quickly, and they figured bringing buckets back was just about as safe as anything else. It could be as successful as anything else. So, yes, sir.
Can you provide a link to the Quest magazine that you showed at the start of the briefing?
Yes, we can provide a link. It's spacebusiness.com/quest.
You were talking about Lockheed Martin, but I'm pretty sure that Lockheed Martin, actually separate companies originally, correct? We had Lockheed and then we had Marietta Martin, and they didn't merge until later. So which
Right.
was the contractor originally?
If I said Lockheed Martin, I was mistaken. It really was the Lockheed Corporation in the 1960s that won the contract. The subcontractor that worked with Lockheed for the ground stations was a company that became Loral. It was even before Ford Aerospace, and I can't remember what the name of the company was. But Lockheed got the good tracking stations, and Loral got the bad tracking stations. The so-called Lockheed got Hawaii, Vandenberg, and New Boston and New Hampshire, and Ford or Loral got they got Kodiak in Alaska. They got Annette Island. Later they got the Seychelles when that one opened up. So they got the good one, but not all the good ones. But you're right. It was the Lockheed Corporation. It wasn't Lockheed Martin.
Sir, you talked about the fact that there were no actual career fields or formal training for the officers and NCOs that first started in this program. So how were they selected? How were those officers and NCOs selected for this program?
I'll use General McCartney as an example. General McCartney's bachelor's degree from Auburn, War Eagle, is actually in nuclear physics. And he went down to Kirtland Air Force Base, the nuclear mecca for the Air Force, and did nuclear stuff for a few years, but he caught the eye of somebody. And that somebody said, I need this guy to come up, I need an engineer to do this kind of stuff, and I need him to come up to Sunnyvale. And basically, McCartney got orders and he moved up to Sunnyvale because he had an engineering background, he had done technical stuff before. That somebody turned out to be Benny Schriever. But that's how those three guys who flew satellites in the beginning were selected, because they had very technical degrees and very technical backgrounds. Somebody like Lou Adams, who comes along in the mid-60s as a second lieutenant, also has an engineering degree, and he has a technical background, and so he gets sent off to a tracking station. But the difference was he had a school to go to because the Air Force had been doing radar stuff for a long time, and so they could send him to radar school knowing that he was going to go to a site that had a big antenna. I mean, that's what they were, right? They were big radars. So they figured they'll send him to radar officer school, get him some technical expertise, but then he goes off to New Boston and he really learns what he has to do. But he has a technical background. As far as the enlisted and the NCOs go, they were selected because they had been in technical career fields. They had been radar maintenance NCOs, or they had worked with oscilloscopes, doing maintenance on that kind of stuff. And that's essentially where they came from as well. But they could never get enough of these guys to populate an entire career field. There just wasn't enough. A lot of these guys, they would get bitten by the space bug, right? And then they go work for somebody in the Apollo program. Or they would have to go off to Vietnam for a year to do some kind of radar maintenance in Vietnam. I mean, there were lots of pressures on the Air Force. Flying satellites was fun, but it wasn't. I mean, let's face it, it's called the United States Air Force, right? And there were just lots of pressures on the Air Force. And the Air Force eventually said, okay, we don't have enough folks to staff all of the tracking stations and the satellite control facility with blue suiters, so we're going to narrow it down to a couple of satellite programs and one tracking station, which was Vandenberg. And they had enlisted guys at Vandenberg, and it was they had officers there and all that sort of thing doing flying satellites. But then they had no place to send them. They were stuck at Vandenberg. There was no place for them to PCS. There was no way to, to get cross-training and cross-experience and all that kind of thing. So the Air Force eventually threw in the towel and said it's going to be all contractors at the ground stations, and we'll have some folks, officers mostly, flying satellites. But even then, not all the satellite programs were staffed by officers. So, thank you. Anyone else? Great. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I really do appreciate it. It's a lot of fun for me, not just to get out of the Pentagon, but to do space history. You don't get to do enough of that in the Pentagon, so I thank you very much for coming today.
So I want to say a few words on behalf of the director. First of all, thank you very much for coming out to talk to us today. I thought that was a fascinating talk. This kind of topic goes way back with me. When I was back in elementary school, I followed the Discover program, space programs in general, but Discover, and was absolutely fascinated by it. So, when I went to college and then got recruited by the CIA, and my first job was as a photo interpreter, imagery analyst. I was very surprised to find that this Discover program really didn't exist. It was a Corona program. And by that time, of course, we were flying the next generation of film return vehicles. And so that kind of goes way back with me. I find it fascinating.
Great.
And people can go down and see some of these artifacts. The flag that was recovered, I believe, is in our lobby over there, the actual flag that came back in that bucket. So very historic artifact over in our lobby that's on loan to us, thanks to the work by CSNR, folks getting that over there. So thanks to the CIO for sponsoring this series, and I'm looking forward to the future lectures over here as well. And thanks to all you folks for coming out today. And the director couldn't be here, but very appropriately so. He has his 50th anniversary coin that was specially minted for the 50th anniversary. And there's his signature. He hasn't given many of these out. So thank you very much for coming out today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.